The bell begins to ring before anyone sees them. It is not the call to prayer, not the gentle toll that marks the hours. This is frantic, desperate. The sound of iron struck in pure terror. A monk stumbles across the cloister, his bare feet slapping against cold stone. He is carrying something, a reliquary perhaps, or a gospel book bound in gold. It doesn't matter. He won't make it to the door. On the horizon, where the river bends past the tree line, shapes emerge from the morning mist. Low and dark, moving faster than anything should move on water. The prows rise like the necks of serpents, and on them, painted eyes stare forward, hunting. There are screams now. Women gathering children. Men reaching for tools that were never meant to be weapons. An old priest falls to his knees, not to fight but to pray. He knows what this is. He has heard the stories, the rumors that traveled faster than any messenger. They came from the sea. They came without warning. They took everything: gold, silver, livestock, people. And when they were finished, they vanished back into the water as if they had never existed at all. But this time, something is different. This time, the ships do not turn around. This time, they stay. The 9th century in Europe was not a time of unity. There was no single nation, no shared government, no coordinated defense. What existed instead was a patchwork: kingdoms and bishoprics, monasteries and trading towns, rural estates and walled cities, each operating under its own laws, its own lords, its own fragile sense of security. And into this fragmented world came a force that would expose every weakness, every crack, every undefended shore. The people who launched these raids were not a single army. They were not an empire. They came from the cold lands to the north, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. But they did not fight under one banner. They formed shifting coalitions, temporary alliances, bands of warriors who might raid together one season and trade peacefully the next. The word Viking itself did not describe a people. It described an activity. To go Viking was to go raiding, to seek fortune through violence and speed. And in the 9th century, they found a continent ripe for the taking. The wealth of Christian Europe was not hidden, it was displayed. Monasteries gleamed with golden crosses, silver chalices, illuminated manuscripts bound in jeweled covers. These were houses of God, and they had been built to inspire awe, not to withstand assault. Their walls were low. Their inhabitants were unarmed. Their treasures were meant for heaven, not for war. But to a crew of 50 men in a shallow-drafted longship, a monastery was not a sacred place. It was a target, undefended, accessible, and filled with portable wealth that could be carried away in a single morning. The first major shock had come in 793, when raiders struck the island monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. The attack was devastating not only in its violence, but in its violation. Monks were killed or dragged away in chains. Altars were overturned. Books that had taken years to create were torn apart for their bindings. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the safety of the Carolingian court, struggled to comprehend it. "Never before," he wrote, "has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." But Lindisfarne was only the beginning. The true horror of the 9th century was not a single raid. It was the realization that the raids would never stop. What made the Scandinavian raiders so effective was not superior numbers. In many engagements they were outnumbered. It was not superior weapons. Swords and axes were common across Europe. What made them unstoppable, at least in the early decades, was mobility. The longship was a masterpiece of engineering. It sat shallow in the water, allowing it to navigate rivers that no other warship could enter. It could be beached on any shore, pulled onto sand or mud, and launched again within minutes. It was fast under sail and maneuverable under oar. A fleet of longships could appear at a coastal town, strike before any defense could be organized, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. And they did not limit themselves to the coast. The rivers of Europe, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Scheldt, had been built as highways of commerce. Merchants traveled them. Pilgrims followed their banks. Towns grew rich at their crossings. But in the 9th century, those same rivers became corridors of invasion. A fleet that entered the mouth of the Seine could reach Paris. A fleet on the Loire could strike deep into the heart of Francia. The waterways that had carried prosperity now carried death. For the people who lived along those rivers, the psychology was devastating. You could not see a raid coming until it was too late. You could not outrun a longship, and you could not know when, or if, another attack would follow. The same fleet that looted your town in June might return in August, might return next spring, might never come again. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, and slowly, across the 830s and 840s, the nature of the threat began to change. Dorstad was one of the great trading centers of northern Europe. Located in the Low Countries near the mouth of the Rhine, it had grown wealthy on commerce, goods flowing in from Britain, from Francia, from the Baltic. Its markets were crowded, its warehouses were full, and in 834 the longships came. The raid was not a one-time disaster. It was the first of many. Year after year, fleets returned to Dorstad, stripping it of whatever wealth had accumulated since the last attack. The town that had once been a symbol of Carolingian prosperity became a symbol of Carolingian vulnerability. Trade routes shifted, merchants fled. The economy of an entire region buckled under repeated assault, and Dorstad was not alone. Across the Frankish kingdoms, the pattern repeated. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were looted and burned. Towns that had never seen war watched their populations scattered. The silver that Christians had accumulated over generations, tithes, donations, the slow accretion of piety made material, was carried away in Scandinavian hulls. By 845, a fleet had pushed up the Seine and reached Paris itself. The city was not yet the fortified capital it would become. It was wealthy, yes. It was symbolically important, but it was also exposed, and when the raiders demanded payment to leave, they received it. Silver changed hands, the fleet withdrew. This was the beginning of a practice that would define the century. Tribute, Danegeld, the price of survival. Paying off a Viking fleet was not cowardice, it was calculation. A kingdom that fought and lost would be devastated. A kingdom that paid might buy time to rebuild defenses, to gather forces, to hope that next year the raiders would go somewhere else. But the payments taught a brutal lesson. Europe could be farmed. Its rulers would pay rather than die, and every bag of silver that crossed from Christian hands to Scandinavian ships was an advertisement. There is more where that came from. In Ireland, the transformation was even more dramatic. The early raids on Irish monasteries had followed the familiar pattern, swift, violent, and temporary. But in the late 830s and early 840s, something changed. The raiders stopped leaving. Irish annals record the appearance of longfjord, ship forts, naval encampments where crews pulled their vessels onto shore and built defenses around them. These were not temporary camps. They were overwintering bases. The raiders would strike inland during the summer, return to their fortified harbors in the autumn, and wait out the cold months with their plunder and their captives. Around 841, a long fort was established on the River Liffey at the site that would become Dublin. The implications were staggering. This was no longer raiding. This was settlement. The men who had come to steal were now staying to rule. They brought slaves from their raids, Irish captives, British captives, captives from the continent, and sold them through networks that stretched across the North Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. Dublin became a node in a vast economy of violence, a place where human beings were currency and terror was a business model. For the Irish kingdoms, the shock was existential. These were not distant threats that might someday arrive. They were neighbors now, fortified neighbors, neighbors who would not leave. In England, the escalation came in 865. The force that landed that year was different from anything the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had faced before. Later chroniclers called it the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of warriors drawn from across Scandinavia, united not for a summer's raiding but for conquest. Their targets were not monasteries, they were kingdoms. Within a few years, the army had shattered the old order. Northumbria fell. East Anglia fell. Its king, Edmund, was killed, later remembered as a martyr, his death surrounded by legends of cruelty and defiance. Mercia, the great power of the English Midlands, was reduced to a rump state, its eastern territories carved away. Only Wessex remained, and in the winter of 878, even Wessex nearly died. King Alfred, not yet the Great, not yet the architect of English survival, was a fugitive. His army had been scattered. His kingdom had been overrun. He retreated to the marshes of Somerset, to a place called Athelney, where the land was too wet and too wild for easy pursuit. There, with a handful of loyal men, he waited. It is one of the pivotal moments of medieval history. A king hiding in a swamp, his kingdom collapsing around him, the future of an entire people balanced on whether he could hold his nerve. He held it. In the spring of 878, Alfred gathered what forces he could and met the army of Guthrum at Edington. The details of the battle are sparse, but the outcome was decisive. The Scandinavian force was broken. Guthrum himself accepted baptism, with Alfred standing as his godfather. A treaty followed, a division of England into zones of influence, with the eastern and northern territories acknowledging Scandinavian law and custom. This was the birth of the Danelaw, not a foreign occupation imposed by pure force but a negotiated reality. The raiders had become rulers. The map of England had been redrawn. On the continent, the pressure continued to build. The Carolingian Empire, the vast Christian realm that Charlemagne had forged, was fracturing. His heirs quarreled. Civil wars divided loyalties, and all the while the longships kept coming. The response, when it came, was piecemeal. In 864, King Charles the Bald issued the Edict of Pitters, a sweeping attempt to organize defense. Rivers were to be blocked with fortified bridges. Towns were to strengthen their walls. Militias were to be ready to muster. The era of passive vulnerability was supposed to end. Some of these measures worked. Fortified bridges on the Seine became chokepoints where fleets could be challenged. But the raiders adapted. They portaged around obstacles. They struck at different rivers. They exploited every gap in the defenses. And in 885, they came for Paris again. The siege of Paris was not a raid. It was a campaign. Hundreds of ships, perhaps fewer than the terrified chroniclers claimed, but still an overwhelming force, appeared on the Seine in late November. Their goal was passage upriver into the rich lands of Burgundy, but Paris sat in their way and Paris refused to move. The city's defense fell to two men, Count Odo, the military commander, and Bishop Goslin, a churchman who proved as willing to fight as any soldier. They had fortified the bridges. They had stockpiled supplies. They had prepared for a siege that everyone knew was coming. What followed was months of horror. The Scandinavian forces attacked the bridges with siege engines, battering rams, fire ships. They assaulted the towers that guarded the crossings. They tried to overwhelm the defenses with sheer numbers, and again the defenders held. Disease struck both sides. Starvation gnawed at the city. Messengers were sent to the Emperor Charles the Fat, the nominal ruler of the Frankish world, begging for relief. Goslin himself died during the siege, worn down by the strain. When the emperor finally arrived, he did not come to fight. He came to negotiate. Charles paid the raiders to leave. He gave them permission to pass upriver and ravage Burgundy, the very lands he was supposed to protect. The siege ended not with victory but with betrayal. The political consequences were profound. Odo, the count who had actually defended Paris, emerged as a hero. Charles, the emperor who had paid off the enemy, was discredited. Within a few years, the Carolingian line would lose control of West Francia entirely. The men who could protect their people would inherit the future. Even the Mediterranean was not safe. In 844, a Scandinavian fleet appeared off the coast of the Iberian Peninsula. They raided along the Atlantic shores, then turned south, entering the Guadalquivir River and striking deep into Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled territory of southern Spain. The city of Seville fell. For a brief, shocking moment, warriors from the frozen north controlled one of the great cities of the Islamic world. The psychological impact was immense. The geographical reach of the raids had been revealed as almost limitless. But Al-Andalus responded differently than the Christian kingdoms. The Umayyad emir mobilized quickly. His forces counterattacked, inflicting severe casualties on the raiders and driving them from the peninsula. Coastal defenses were strengthened. Watchtowers were built. The lesson was learned and learned fast. The contrast was instructive. Where power was centralized and response was swift, the raiders could be defeated. Where power was fragmented and response was slow, they thrived. And in the East, the phenomenon took yet another form. Scandinavian traders and warriors had been pushing along the river routes of Eastern Europe for decades, down the Dnieper, down the Volga, toward the Black Sea and the Caspian. These were not the same groups raiding Paris and Dublin, but they were part of the same expansion, the same outward pressure from the northern lands. In 860, a fleet associated with the Rus, a term whose exact meaning scholars still debate but which referred to Scandinavian-connected groups in the east, appeared before the walls of Constantinople. The greatest city in Christendom, the heir of Rome, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the attack did not succeed. The walls held, but the message was clear. Nowhere was truly safe. The reach of the northern ships extended from the monasteries of Ireland to the domes of Byzantium. How do you live under such a shadow? For the ordinary people of 9th century Europe, the question was not abstract. It was daily. It was visceral. You learned to watch the water, to listen for the bells, to keep your valuables hidden, your children clothes, your escape route planned. You learned that the river that brought trade also brought death, that the dawn might bring sails on the horizon, that everything you had built, your home, your family, your life, could be gone by noon. Monasteries relocated their treasures. Some communities moved inland. Farmers clustered near fortified sites, trading independence for the hope of protection. The rhythms of rural life, planting, harvesting, praying, continued, but always with one eye on the horizon. The church interpreted the raids as divine punishment. God was angry. The sins of Christendom had brought this scourge upon them. The Vikings were instruments of heavenly wrath sent to chastise a wayward people. This explanation offered a kind of meaning. The horror was not random, it was deserved. But it also deepened the despair. If God himself had sent the raiders, what defense could mere mortals mount? And yet defense came. The 9th century did not end with the collapse of European civilization. It ended with transformation. The fortified towns that rulers built to stop the raiders became the nuclei of new urban growth. The local strongmen who organized resistance became the founders of new dynasties. The tribute that drained treasuries also taught rulers the cost of weakness and the necessity of strength. In England, Alfred's survival became the foundation of a unified kingdom. The Danelaw was not erased, it was absorbed. Over the following century, Alfred's descendants would reconquer the territories that had been lost, forging a single English realm from the wreckage of the old kingdoms. In Francia, the Carolingian order gave way to a more localized system of power. The men who could protect their lands, the counts and dukes who built castles and maintained armies, became the real rulers. The age of great empires faded. The age of feudal lordship began. In Ireland, the Longfjord evolved into genuine towns. Dublin, founded as a slave market and raiding base, became a center of trade, craft, and eventually Christian culture. The invaders intermarried. Their children spoke Irish. Their grandchildren built churches. And across Europe, the experience of the 9th century left a permanent mark on the collective memory. The fear of the sea. The importance of walls, the knowledge that civilization is fragile, that wealth attracts predators, that the price of peace is eternal vigilance. There is a temptation from the distance of 1,000 years to see the Viking raids as a colorful chapter in a long story. Adventurers in dragon ships, warriors with strange gods, a dramatic interlude before the medieval world settled into its familiar patterns. But for the people who lived through it, there was no distance. There was no perspective. There was only the morning the ships appeared, the screaming, the smoke, the chains. A monk watches his brothers dragged away, their fate unknown. A merchant watches his livelihood burn. A mother watches her child torn from her arms, destined for a slave market she will never see. These were not characters in a saga. They were people. And their world, the world they had known, the world they had trusted, was ending. The 9th century taught Europe a lesson it would never forget. Security is not given. It is built. It is defended. It is paid for in blood and silver and sleepless nights. The rivers that connect also expose. The wealth that prospers also attracts. And somewhere always there are ships on the water, waiting. The longships are gone now. Their crews are dust. But the question they posed, how do you survive when the world turns hostile, when the things you built become targets, when the horizon holds nothing but threat? That question never goes away. It is asked in every century, in every language, by every people who have ever watched the edge of their world and wondered what was coming. For Europe in the 9th century, what came was fire and iron and chains. What remained when the smoke cleared was a continent transformed. Not broken, transformed. And in that transformation, in the walls that rose, the kingdoms that formed, the cultures that merged, lies a truth as old as civilization itself. We do not simply endure the darkness, we build from it.